Today we are entering one of the most sensitive and most misunderstood topics in startups, ownership. When an agri-startup begins, everything feels simple. There are only a few people involved, the founder, maybe a co-founder, and a small early team. Because of that simplicity, many founders make decisions about equity, ESOPs, and ownership very casually. But the truth is, these early decisions can shape the future of the company for the next 10-20 years. In agriculture startups, this issue becomes even more critical. Unlike many tech startups, agri-ventures usually take longer to scale, require field operations, and depend heavily on people working on the ground. That means ownership structures must be thought through very carefully. In this part of the module, we will discuss three very important things. First, how much ESOP pool is considered normal in startups, and how founders should plan it from the beginning. Second, we will look at the reality of ESOPs in agriculture startups, because the dynamics in agribusinesses are very different from Silicon Valley-style tech companies. And third, we will explore some of the most common equity mistakes founders make, mistakes that later create conflicts between founders, employees, and investors. If you understand this topic properly, you will avoid many problems that destroy startups not because of market failure, but because of ownership conflicts. So in this lecture, we are going to break down ESOPs, founder equity, and ownership structures in a very practical way, specifically for agriculture startups.
Part SAT, how much ESOP pool is normal? When founders decide to introduce an ESOP, employee stock option plan, the next important question is how much of the company should be reserved for employees. In most early-stage startups, API, DUS petitioned ESOP pool is considered normal. This means the founders set aside DUS petition of the company's total equity, specifically for current and future employees. This pool is created before hiring many team members, so that the company already has equity available to reward people who join and contribute to the startup's growth. However, founders must be very careful when giving equity. Equity should never be promised casually. Unlike salary or bonuses, equity represents permanent ownership in the company. Once it is given, it becomes very difficult to take it back without legal complications or conflicts. That is why smart founders treat equity as a precious resource, not as a quick incentive. Who should receive ESOP? The ESOP pool should be used only for people who are critical to the company's long-term success, such as long-term team members who stay committed to the startup, high-responsibility roles that significantly influence the company's growth, people who grow with the company, take ownership, and contribute beyond basic job duties. A founder's mindset about ESOP. Good founders understand that equity is not just compensation, it is ownership. Giving equity means sharing the future value of the company.
Part 8, ESOP in Agriculture, Reality Check. While ESOP, Employee Stock Option Plan, is a powerful tool in startups, founders must understand that every industry and workforce thinks differently about incentives. Agriculture is one of those sectors where the mindset of employees can be very different from technology startups. In many agri-startups, especially those working closely with field operations, employees often prioritize different things. Field staff usually value stable and predictable income, respect and fair treatment in the workplace, job security and long-term stability. For many people working in field roles, monthly cash salary is more important than future equity. The idea of owning a small percentage of a startup may feel uncertain compared to a reliable paycheck. Because of this reality, founders should be careful about where ESOP is used. ESOP tends to work best for core team members who help build the company from the beginning, managers or leadership roles responsible for important decisions, early leaders who take ownership of growth and strategy. These individuals usually understand the long-term value of equity and are willing to take some risk in exchange for potential upside. However, founders should avoid forcing ESOP in situations where cash clarity matters more to the employee. If someone depends heavily on stable income, Offering equity instead of proper salary can create frustration rather than motivation. Part 9. Common equity mistakes by first-time agri founders. When founders start a company for the first time, equity decisions are often made emotionally or informally. At the early stage, everything feels friendly and flexible. But in reality, equity is one of the most serious decisions in a startup because it determines who owns the company in the long run. Many first-time agri-founders make a few common mistakes that later create major problems. Understanding these early can save a startup from future conflict. 1. Giving equity to friends without real contribution. Sometimes founders give equity to friends simply because they helped at the beginning, introduced someone, or showed moral support. But equity should only go to people who consistently contribute to building the company. If someone is not actively involved in operations, strategy, or growth, giving them ownership can become a long-term burden. 2. Promising equity verbally. Another common mistake is making verbal promises like, "Don't worry, you'll get shares later. We will give you equity once the company grows." Without a written agreement, these promises can create misunderstandings. When the company starts growing and equity becomes valuable, people may remember conversations differently, leading to disputes. 3. No written agreement. Every equity arrangement must be documented clearly in writing. This includes founder agreements, shareholding structure, ESOP terms, vesting schedules. Written agreements protect both the company and the individuals involved. 4. No vesting structure. As discussed earlier, vesting is essential. Without vesting, someone who leaves early can still keep a large portion of the company. This can create unfair situations and discourage the people who continue building the startup. 5. Ignoring future investors. Many early founders distribute equity without thinking about future fundraising. If too much equity is given away early, the company may struggle later when investors want a stake in the business. Investors usually look for clean and logical ownership structures. If the cap table is messy, it can reduce the chances of getting funding. Part 10. Think like a long-term owner. Before finalizing the equity structure of a startup, founders must adopt a long-term ownership mindset. Equity decisions are not just about solving today's situation. They shape the company's structure for many years to come. At the early stage, founders often distribute equity quickly to maintain harmony within the team. Everyone wants to feel valued, and sometimes founders agree to equity splits just to avoid difficult conversations. But this short-term comfort can create serious problems later. That is why good founders pause and ask a few important questions before finalizing any equity structure. First, will this structure still feel fair after 5 years? In the early days, contributions may appear similar, but over time some people may take on greater responsibility, work longer, and drive the company's growth. The equity structure should reflect long-term contribution potential, not just early enthusiasm. Second, will investors be comfortable with this cap table? When startups raise funding, investors carefully examine the cap table ownership structure. If too much equity is already distributed among inactive members or loosely defined roles, investors may see it as a risk. Third, does this structure truly motivate the right people? Equity should be given to those who will build, lead, and grow the company. If the structure rewards people who are not deeply involved, it can demotivate the individuals who are actually doing the hard work. The key principle founders must remember is simple. Short-term peace often creates long-term pain. Avoiding uncomfortable discussions today might make the team feel good in the moment, but unresolved equity issues can later lead to conflicts, broken partnerships, and difficulties in raising investment. Outcome: by the end of Module 4 in the Field to Founder Conference, you have developed a strong foundation in one of the most important aspects of building a startup: ownership structure. In this module, we explored how equity works inside a startup and why it must be handled carefully from the very beginning. At this stage, you should now have a clear understanding of founder equity and how ownership is divided between founders and co-founders. You have also learned the logic behind fair equity splits. That equity should be based on real contribution, responsibility, and long-term commitment, rather than friendship or early enthusiasm alone. Another key concept we discussed was vesting, which ensures that ownership is earned over time. Vesting protects the startup from situations where someone leaves early but still holds a large portion of the company. We also introduced the basics of ESOP, Employee Stock Option Plan, and how startups use it as a strategic tool to attract, retain, and motivate key team members, especially when cash resources are limited. At this point, your startup's ownership structure is strong enough to support future growth. A clear and disciplined equity structure not only protects the founding team, but also makes the company more attractive to future investors. In the next module, we will move to another crucial stage of startup building: fundraising basics for agri-startups, where you will learn how startups raise capital, how investors evaluate businesses, and how founders should prepare before approaching investors.